Howdy folks, in today's episode we'll find out how you get from fashion photography to being shot at in Syria and photographing some of the world's most dangerous war zones such as Iraq and Afghanistan right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts, and before we get into it, I've got one thing to ask of you. I've noticed that over 65% of our viewers, it might actually be sort of 70% of our viewers on YouTube and listeners, and listeners on audio, are not actually subscribed to this channel. I mean, come on, people. You can really help me out by hitting that subscribe button. It'll help me get even more amazing guests on the show, although that might actually not even possible. Just one click. That is all it takes. Thank you so much. Now, without further ado, let's give it up for today's special guest, the award-winning photographer and filmmaker, photojournalist, war photographer, director, and founder of Bang Bang Studio, Sebastiano Tomada. Sebastiano, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Very well. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show this week. I saw your work, and I have to say I was completely and utterly flabbergasted. Give our listeners and viewers on YouTube so far a helicopter view over what it is that you do.
Oh my God. I mean, I've had so many transitions throughout my work career that I don't even know where I would start. I've gotten to the point now where I've kind of abandoned the whole war reporting, war conflict reporting and photojournalism. And I focus more now on the commercial world when it comes to photography and video. So technically now I am a director of photography / director / producer, and I have a little team, and we shoot a lot of, commercials, ads, pharmaceuticals, docuseries. In fact, now we're in pre-production for another docuseries that is scheduled to start shooting in October. And that's pretty much it. But it really all started with my introduction to the world of let's say, visuals. When I started assisting a lot of fashion photographers back in the day, I was still in school. I was a studio manager for some of them, and for others, I was their personal first assistant. So on sets, on campaigns, some of them included, Steven Meisel, Wayne Mazer, had a little stint with Mario Testino due to my Italian background. It was a really fun part of my life because I feel fashion photography was at its apex in 2009, 2008, 2009, 2010. And everybody was trying to, create the coolest, best team. And I was being, pushed and pulled from one photographer to another because they wanted to have me because I was good at this, but not that. And then I went to school. I went to Parsons. I studied photography and media studies. And initially my intention was to be, the greatest, most famous fashion photographer there could be. And living in New York, hanging out with the models on these amazing sets with great catering and, the best dressed people you can imagine. I quickly realized that was not my world. It wasn't my style. I really wasn't built for that. And still kept with photography, started doing more commercial work on my own. Was very lucky to be picked up by a French news agency at the time, which was SIPA Press. And they kind of utilized me as I don't even know what I was really doing. They would just send me all over the country and take portraits of either CEOs or personalities. And that's when my career started getting a little bit more business-like, let's say. And then there was an offering. All of a sudden, they were like, "Who wants to go and cover the war in Afghanistan?" And I was offered a position to embed with U.S. troops over there. Packed up my bags And out of nowhere, I just started covering the war in Afghanistan, and that was in 2000. That started in 2010, 2011.
How difficult was that decision to actually? I mean, if somebody said to me, right, you're going to embed with U.S. troops in Afghanistan, which at the time was basically a hotbed of armed conflict, basically. I mean, how easy or difficult was that decision to actually take that job?
It was the easiest decision ever. I mean, I grew up with my father. Probably should have not done it at that young age, but I think I've saw every possible war movie with my father between the age of like 7 and 12. Going from Full Metal Jacket to Hamburger Hill to all the classics. So I was always deeply fascinated with anything that had to do with conflict. And I had this, although at the time I was living in Italy, I had this passion and respect for the U.S. Army soldier. They were the best, the strongest. They would sacrifice themselves for their country, liberty, freedom. So I always was like, you know what? If things don't go well for me, I'm going to become a U.S. soldier. I'm going to become a special forces soldier. Obviously, things changed. I ended up, going to school, trying to build a career for myself, not trying to scare the crap out of my parents. And but I still ended up doing that by going to Afghanistan. And no, it was very easy. It was very easy. I was just too curious. I think it's, I mean, I don't know how to put this. I think everybody, as bad as conflict and war are, I think everybody should be exposed to some form of, um, some form of conflict, armed conflict. It just puts you in a different perspective. You see life in a different way. And I just wanted to experience that first person, and it wasn't a very gradual experience. I literally got in country, stayed in country for like in Kabul for 3 days, and then I was on a C-130 going to a base, and then hopping into a helicopter, Black Hawk, going into another base, into another, and until I found myself with the 101st Airborne, an artillery division that was actually doing infantry work. And they were doing infantry work because the situation was so bad that they didn't have enough people. So they were going with the infantryman pretty much on the front line, although there wasn't a defined front line. And the combat was insane. I mean, within the first week, I mean, I saw 3 American soldiers die, you know?
Did you have any military training, or did they give you any training, or nothing at all?
No, no. You just sign a waiver that pretty much says that if you get blown up, it's not, it's not their responsibility. I obviously had insurance, but insurance can only do so much. It's mostly evacuation insurance. And I did have a very bad accident in 2014. Um, and that's it. And then I got hooked. I got hooked, and I think I got hooked because I ended up making friends very easily there on the ground, and because taking photographs honestly, it's almost like cheating. Taking photos in a war zone is pretty much cheating. Yeah, you're reporting, you're bringing back the truth, information, visuals back home, but it's so easy to make these photos look amazing. You can't be in a photo with an explosion or a soldier shooting, and his expression is you see his teeth, he's grinding, he's shooting. So it was almost too easy. You just had to not do the stupid thing and make sure you were putting your feet in the right spot in order to avoid stepping on an explosive device, and kind of following the lead of of the platoon leader, of the unit leader.
I mean, that's actually an interesting point, because I often think when I look at war photography, and I'm fascinated by conflict photography, and that's really mainly the storytelling aspect. Whether it might be conflicts as in, like, I don't know, some demonstrations that are going on, in like major cities about whatever, or whether it's like riots. Like we had riots in London. I know you had riots in LA some time ago. Those are they're interesting because they really show the sort of rawest aggression of humanity in a sense, and that is innately interesting if you don't come from a place like that. I often think like, well, I live here in London. It's, well, for the most part, it's pretty suburban. Not much happens. It's for the most part, it's a fairly safe environment.
Right.
And so these extreme situations to me are really fascinating, and interesting. But of course, then there's a whole story behind that, and I wonder, because you said it's not difficult to get great shots when basically shit's blowing up around you. Is that a little bit like? Because I always think of that when I think of fashion photography. It's not really that difficult to take a great photograph of a really super awesome looking model.
Right.
Most of the time.
Well,
Is that a little bit similar?
it's true to a certain extent. I mean, there are more technicalities to fashion photography. I mean, just to give you an idea, on most sets back in the day when the budgets were real, I would say you would have a team, of 3 lighting techs, a first assistant, a second assistant, DIT, a digital tech guy, hair and makeup. So you're talking about a team of almost 10 people, to make that one shot happen. And most of the times out of an entire day, a 12-hour day, sometimes you would only choose like 2 photos and you would be shooting all day.
Yeah.
So yes, it is easier. The clothing are beautiful. The models are beautiful. The lighting is obviously beautiful. But I see what you're saying. I guess that part can translate to the logistics of going all the way to Afghanistan,
Yeah.
or familiarizing yourself with the area and being able to navigate, the complexity of an army, all the
Yeah.
bureaucracy. Kissing a lot of ass, being like, hey, I'm not stupid. I'm not going to make your guys look bad. I'm going to make them look cool. We're going to get cool front covers from big publications. Because, when you go to a war zone, there are hotbeds, hot areas, and non-hot areas. Everybody wants to go to the hot area because they want to get the award-winning images, right? They want to make their agent, the newspaper happy. But it's kind of a very complicated process. You have to go through a public affairs officer. You have to put in a request. You have to explain to them why. You have to look and present yourself like you're the real deal. You're a professional. I was at that time, what was I, 21 years old, 22 years old, when I went there the first time. I was as green as they get. I had no idea what was going on, but I still made it happen.
Did you tell them that you were coming from fashion photography? What did they think about that?
No. Well, you see, what made it different back then is that you wouldn't be able to access these areas if you weren't an accredited photographer, right? Like if you weren't backed up by an agency or a publication, which is very different from what's happening now in Ukraine. Anybody with a camera can just cross the border and go to these ragtag units and be like, hey guys, you want some cool photos? I'm going to follow you guys, different. But yeah, thank God they didn't think I was as green as I actually was. And they trusted me, they believed me. And next thing you know, I was, sleeping in mud houses with these guys and eating MREs and counting the amount of bottles that you could actually consume a day, because resupplies were every other week, yeah.
How aware were you of this sort of operational details? I mean, you were embedded with the unit. So how aware were you of what was about to happen? I mean, how much planning could you put into that? Or was it literally, sorry, I'm dropping things. Was it literally more of a thing of like, you get a wake up call and it's like, all right, we're moving out, get on the truck, and then just see what happens?
Very little information was given to a journalist, to a photographer. I mean, they would tell you like, this is the main goal, a general picture of what the unit was tasked to do. In this case, the unit that I was with was specifically tasked to, how do you say it, eradicate Taliban presence in this village. And we were surrounding this village day by day, field by field for 2 weeks. and it was a very slow moving type of operation. You would move 500 meters, you would post, they would do observations, you would see what kind of enemy movement you would be able to get eyes on. If it was too far, too complicated, they would call in helicopters, Kiowas, the small, low flying ones that almost feels like you can touch them. um, and then other times they would just call in direct operations. So in the middle of the night, or super 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 early in the morning, right before or during morning prayer, uh, you would attack. And most of the times it would be a last minute type of thing. And the reason why they did that wasn't necessarily, now that I think about it, wasn't necessarily because of me, but was because the US Army was attached always to an Afghan unit, an Afghan military unit. And they did not want to disclose that information to too many people, because they didn't want the Afghans to find out what the details would be for the next 6 hours to a day, because a lot of them were, corrupt, or they were in touch with the Taliban. You know,
Yeah,
um,
informant basically.
yeah, yeah, little informants. Everything was very sensitive, in that way. Information was.
And when aggression started, so when like let's say when the sort of the actual attack would start, would you be hanging back, or would you be like right in the front of it? I mean, how
I
how
would
how much in the action were you?
I would say that when the actual action was happening, I was 80% to 90% there. Um, and obviously that action is, war is 80% weight and 20% action. But when that 20 came about, you would do everything you could to take, the shot that you wanted. And what I learned throughout the years was I always ended up trying to find the guys within the unit that were the smartest tactically, not the craziest, and that would technically also take care of me, or that I could, build a relationship relatively easily. And I would usually follow those guys and be right behind them, you know.
Yeah, because that's security in that situation must be an absolute nightmare. I'm just thinking, there.
Yeah, nobody's protecting you. No, it's not their job. It's your job. I mean, obviously they will tell you don't go down that path, because we went down that path yesterday with mine detectors and we got a lot of feedback. So don't go that way. But during a firefight, it's kind of everybody for themselves. Things change drastically if somebody gets hit, or if the mission changes. But it's really your own responsibility to not get in the way of anyone, and yeah, not interfere into the operation.
And I'm guessing you're not armed in that situation, or were you armed for your own
No,
protection?
no, I was never armed. One time in 2000, and I think it was 14 or 15, in the mountains of Kunar, on the border with Pakistan, I was given a gun and I was given a radio, and I very gladly took both. And I was like, given a gun, why not? I mean, it's against you know journalistic code, but I'm very happy to disclose the fact that I did carry a gun for one day, one night, actually, on an operation. um, and that was the last time I did that, because the radio that I actually had, I ended up losing in the middle of the night, and that caused a lot of problems, because for the next 48 to 3 days, 48 hours, 72 hours, they had to send out multiple patrols to try and go and retrieve that radio, because they didn't want it to get into the hands of the enemy. And believe it or not, the lieutenant that was leading that operation, and that gave me that radio, got demoted because of that
Oh wow.
accident. Yeah, I learned my lesson and I never took anything. Um,
I bet they loved you for that.
War. Thank God I only had a week left um, with them. And the only reason why I carried the gun that time, it was mostly because I was particularly afraid, and we were going into a series of buildings that were supposed to be cleared. And during the briefing, everybody told us that, the chances of, wounded in action or killed in action were going to be relatively high. In fact, one guy lost his life, two guys, three guys were critically wounded. And for some reason, that just gave me a sense of security. I didn't even know how to use a gun. I probably would have not even used it,
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. Yeah, that's why I was asking earlier, how much training you had going into that situation, in terms of military training, or just in terms of like survival training or something, because I'm guessing, when things go crazy in a firefight, it's probably not necessarily that hard to sort of, get left behind or get lost or whatever, especially at night. That must have been really difficult.
Right. Well, I think that's something that you cannot really learn at a course. I think that's something that you learn throughout years and years of experience, embedding yourself with, military units, or just years in the field. I feel like that's the only way that you can really learn all the tricks for when it comes to conflict.
Yeah, because you're constantly at risk in that sort of situation.
Most of the times, yes.
What happens with the photographs? Did you, once you've shot, let's say once you come back from an operation, do you have to go through almost like a censorship process, whereby did you have to hand your photographs over and so on? How does that work?
The U.S. military was great, and they were very lax in that sense. The only thing that you were not allowed to do were you were not allowed to take photos of dead soldiers. There was an embargo on that, a blackout, media blackout when it came to that. You were not allowed. In fact, whenever anybody in your operational area would get killed, they would actually shut down all communications. So nobody could actually bring out the information. Like, let's say a friend of the soldier that died, was not able to get in touch with the family and tell them, Mikey just got killed. They would block out all information. It was called media blackout. And the reason was because they wanted first to get all the information, get all the paperwork together, and then, the public affairs officers, I guess in this case as well, would contact the family and give them the information. But yes, you weren't allowed to do that. And obviously, they would check. I would have to file daily. So I was filing daily photos back to the agency or newspaper, unless I was working on a specific story. They would check, your photos. I think they would mostly check your captions, that you weren't making up stuff or you weren't adding too much information. You know what I mean? But that was pretty much it. They were very helpful. Everybody was very, very cool.
It's interesting because I remember, a conversation I had with Ben Beale, who's a British Army photographer. And I remember him telling me, one of the biggest things from the photography side of things is to basically not disclose any, secret technology, radio technology, something like that. Did you have to go through a censorship process for that, or how did that work in your? Because again, it's fairly chaotic, I guess.
It is very chaotic. I mean, another thing you weren't able to do was you weren't able to go at the beginning of briefings into the talk, it was called, which is the tactical company room where they had all the maps and all the computers. You weren't allowed to photograph that. And they would tell you, like, look, dude, you can take photos of whatever you want. You can take photos of me naked, sleeping. I don't care. Just don't come into the talk before the first briefing and take photos of the equipment and the maps, because that's not going to play in nobody's favor. So yeah, sensitive information, you wouldn't do that, but you wouldn't want to do that. You know what I mean? You would, a lot of times you would also ask, because you had to understand that you were their guests, right? You were staying with them for a month, and on smaller bases, with smaller units, sometimes you were taking somebody else's bunk, like the lieutenant would come and be like, hey, private, move your shit, let the photographer stay there. You were already making an enemy because one of the guys was being, put to sleep on the floor to accommodate the journalist, who was supposed to be like, treated as a princess. It's a weird experience. I mean, you also have to have common sense, in these places. You want them to become your friends before you start taking photos, and gain their trust.
Again, that's the sort of thing I find really, really interesting. It's the human stories, within all of that chaos, because there are stories, human stories in particular, everywhere. First of all, of course, within the regiment or the whatever the battle group that you're embedded with, but also, of course, the human stories on the other side. Civilians and and potentially even like enemy combatants or whatever. How easy was it to really get on the good side of the unit that you were embedded with? Like, did it take long to make friends, or how quickly did that happen?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the biggest thing was, I guess, going on every possible operation that they were, or every patrol, like not be the guy that was avoiding the 4 a.m. patrol, which required everybody to get up at 3 a.m., like showing them that you were willing to sacrifice your sleep to be out there, even if it was a stupid and ordinary, security patrol around the base, right? That was probably unnecessary, but showing face, asking the guys, when they were eating, like, hey, can I hang out with you guys? Like, what's up? I would always bring 2 cartons of cigarettes from Kabul, every single time I would go out there, which sounds very old school, but worked a lot. Because in a lot of these patrol bases, the smaller ones, again, you would get resupplied once every 2 weeks if you were lucky, and everybody would chain smoke. You would run out of cigarettes, and you definitely did not want to smoke the cigarettes of not the Taliban, the Afghan army that was attached to that unit, because they were the nastiest. I mean, I remember they were called pine, and they were just, it was smoking paper, like cardboard, stuff like that. Being respectful, being cool, being funny.
I think that reminds me of the first time I ever smoked a Gauloise, or whatever it was called. It was terrible.
Oh, the French ones? Yeah. Oh my God, yeah. But that was it. I mean, again, having common sense, playing it cool, trying to make friends, and really get really close to, to the big guys there, and the LTs, the lieutenant colonels, if there was one on a small patrol base. I remember one time I was embedded with a unit of the 82nd Airborne, and this was a pretty interesting story, because this was the last week of this unit in country, right? and they were still in the midst of chaos. So the pressure was high. Nobody wanted to get hurt, right? And the story was the last patrol. So we covered them for the last, like, 3 or 4 patrols before they were free and clear to go back home. But you could see it. You could smell the stress, like imagine getting hit or getting killed the last week before you leave the country. Right. And in that case, in that scenario, I remember very well how difficult it was to talk to these guys, to get close to them. Also, it's like, what's the point? In 1 week, we're gone. I don't want to talk to a reporter. I don't want to do something stupid. I don't want to not focus on my patrol because I'm talking to this guy and showing him where we get attacked from. And then next thing you know, I step on a landmine, Then you fall into these type of scenarios where you're like, whoa, let me take a step back and literally be a little fly on the wall, try to make it as easy as possible. Because you don't want to be responsible for anything as well, right? Like that will live in your conscious forever. Kind of like losing a radio,
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, when you're in that kind of situation, in such an intensely stressful and extremely dangerous situation, and you're embedded in a unit and you're going out on operations, day after day, and you get closer to those guys and you make friends. How difficult is it to then be confronted with the realities of war, where people get injured, they get hit, potentially die? Did you experience that during that tour?
I experienced that on my first embed within the first 2 weeks. It was Operation Stout. No, the combat outpost was called Stout. The operation was called Operation Babber. And within the first week, I was, they had created these HESCO barriers, which are just these let's just call them these sand barriers. And we would sleep on the corner of one of the HESCO barriers that was facing towards technically the enemy. And the reason why we were doing that is because if they were actually launching artillery, it would either hit the wall or it would pass right over us, right? So you were at the furthest corner. And I remember that one of the guys that was next to me was Stout. Hence, they named the base Stout in his honor. And I slept next to Stout, I would say 4 or 5 nights. And, we weren't best friends, but we had conversations. We would share cigarettes. I would shove him away from me when his boot would get in my, either in my shin or in my thigh. I think a week in that operation, two teams had split up to go and look at this building, this mud house, and he stepped on an ID that morning, and very fortunately died immediately because he probably would have never made it anyways. I mean, his entire bottom got destroyed, and that kind of hit me hard. But it doesn't hit you very hard when you're there. It kind of hits you hard months and months after you're back home, and all of a sudden you're having dinner with a friend, and that thing pops into your head, and you're like, well, one day I was sleeping next to this guy. The next day, I hear an explosion, and 5 minutes later I hear over the radio, hey, Stout is down. Stout is gone. He's dead, and that kind of stuff happened also, in Syria, and Iraq,
Because that's the thing that always fascinates me. It's, I can see how there would be sort of a delayed response, and once you're back in inverted commas, civilization,
Mm-hmm.
your brain would have to kind of work through all of those experiences, and I can totally understand how that must really come and hit you hard, sometime later. But then you made a decision to go back, to go to Syria and places like Iraq.
Awesome.
What made you want to go through that experience again?
A different type of enemy, or a different type of challenge. Let's put it that way. I don't think I would define anybody as an enemy. Let me put it that way. I think it was more of the challenge of getting to a country, making the right contacts, being able to embed yourself into these units. Now embedding yourself with Iraqi army forces, and all these like ragtag militias. Trust me, was a little bit more difficult than embedding with the U.S. Army. Again, challenge and the will to experience combat in a different, I wouldn't say a different region per se, but under a different modality, with lots of freedom.
I mean, that's the thing also, I'm just wondering, I can sort of see how, embedded with a U.S. Army, battalion, or whatever you call them, regiment, or like even a British Army group or something, as difficult as that may be, there's still, their commonalities, both culturally and, of course, most importantly, language-wise.
Right.
But when you're embedded with, let's say, an Iraqi group, how do you even, how do you communicate with these guys? So how difficult is that?
A lot of times I would have a fixer with myself, so somebody that would be able to translate, although it was very difficult to find fixers that would be willing to stay with you weeks at a time, and go on actual, door to door, window to window, building to building operations. So it was a mix of me being either introduced to a unit, having my fixer stay with me for a couple of days, and then be like, I'll come pick you up in a week. But a lot of times they were excited to have a Westerner, like a Westerner was cool. Like, hey, there will almost be jealousy in between units. Be like, wait a second, why does that unit get the attention of a photographer from the US? Like, how cool is that?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to get their pictures taken. And becoming friends over there is becomes very, very easy, like, again, the cigarette, the food, the simple stories, them making fun of you in a funny way, of how you say certain things, because the first thing you learn over there when you're embedded with these units is like, where's the enemy, where's the sniper, where's the tank, where's the food. That's really all you need to know, right? Like the Baba, the tank, Kanas, the sniper, all those things. Mushkila, where's the danger? If you wanted to go somewhere, it's like, is there danger there? Is there mushkila there? And they'd be like, yeah. Don't go over there. That's all you really needed to know. And then it was really
some very basics.
Yeah, fun.
Yeah,
almost too fun.
How did you manage to build up relationships with these guys in those units?
Oh yeah, I built some great relationships. I'm still friends with a lot of them on Facebook. We write to each other every other month. It's funny. We exchange pictures, of our children. When they go on leave, they go to Baghdad and they show the great life they're having, and I show, a picture of myself, I don't know, with friends or at a bar. It's great. It's great. Yeah.
Coming back to the photography part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that really strikes me about your imagery is that it really sort of captures kind of human, emotion and so on and so forth, or it sort of captures the humanity of your subject. How do you approach that in a situation like that where you're potentially under fire? Like, how much time do you really have to think? And what's your sort of go-to approach in that sort of situation?
When it comes to non-combatants?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, in sort of a, in a high pressure situation, well, I'm thinking, like, if I just think about how I would respond, in that situation, not that I've ever been in a war situation, but, I don't know. I don't know. It's like, it's hard for me to imagine how, yeah, it's just, I find it very fascinating to think that, you can create that kind of imagery when you're under that much pressure, you know?
Right. I've always tried to focus on expressions. I feel like expressions are the ones that like convey the most amount of information. Like an expression can very well be enough information that you don't even need a caption. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Um, I've always tried to focus on that human emotion, obviously. That is as strong as it can be. Um, I don't know. It's a tough question. Part of it stems also on how you feel at that moment. What are you feeling in that situation? Like, if the pressure's not high, then is it even worth it taking a photo? Like, what are you really trying to convey? A soldier walking with a weapon? No, you want to try to convey a situation of extreme stress, of panic, of fear, right? And you'll probably end up realizing that once you actually feel it inside your own body, right? Okay, it clicks. Okay, from now on, I know that this is the emotional status not only of mine but also of these guys, because these guys can be, they can look very strong and fearless, but trust me, deep inside, these guys are more scared than I am. You know what I mean? They're the ones that are going to take the next step, right? It's their fault if they shoot a civilian instead of a Taliban, right? Like, that's going to live on their conscience for the rest of their lives. Um, Again, stepping, the big thing in Afghanistan was always like this constant paranoia of stepping in the wrong place, you know, pressure plate that would blow you or your friends, up in the sky. Um, Pressure plates that wouldn't even be able to get detected by, these minesweepers, metal detectors. Um, so again, I think it was relatively easy. I mean, it's everything is very situational over there, and that's why it's also very difficult, in my opinion, to not be able to take a good photo. And that's also one of the reasons why a lot of times, us journalists end up getting hurt, because we've seen it all. Well, not all, but we've seen most of it, and you're constantly trying to like push the boundaries and try to get the crazy shot, you know, that's going to be on the front page of a great newspaper or magazine, and that's going to win you an award. I mean, a lot of times that's what it sounds pretty stupid, but a lot of times that's what us photographers think. Like, what am I risking my life for? It's not really the money. That's not a business where you make a great living. No, it's the recognition. It's coming back home and being like, whoa, guy, like, you got balls of steel. Like, those images are crazy. I didn't even know that you could experience that kind of stuff. A lot of times you're just doing it for yourself. You know, the magazine, the newspaper is almost like an excuse.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, I'm sort of, really very fascinated about the, the ability to tell these human stories in a photograph under that much pressure. And I have to say, I mean, I've always been fascinated with that, going back to, World War II photographers, for example, who were embedded at the time, with different units. And I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing because you're, an independent, press photographer, photojournalist, as opposed to somebody who is part of the military, like,
Mm-hmm.
an army photographer, for
Mm-hmm.
example, uh, the the emphasis on the story that you're telling is very different from somebody who's part of the military, who might be documenting the actual operation, for example.
Right.
But in your case, it's not only the guys that you're embedded with, but it's also, of course, the civilians that are being affected by all this, or the other combatants.
Environment,
How did
yeah,
how did that
surrounding.
affect you? How did that affect you?
Well, in Afghanistan, it was very weird, because I'll tell you something that might blow your mind. I don't think I probably have seen, actually, the only time I've seen actually two Taliban fighters, was during an operation. I'll never forget this. We turn a corner. We were entering a town. We turned the corner. We thought the town was empty, and we see two Taliban fighters barefoot. One of them didn't even have a shirt on, and both of them were carrying a recoilless rifle, which is a small, like rocket propelled machine. And that was the only time I saw two Taliban fighters. Um, Obviously, they stopped them, they got arrested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in all the years in Afghanistan, I don't think I've ever seen a Taliban fighter like up close. I've seen a few dead, but it was always like kind of like a mystery ghost type of enemy, you know? It was mostly IDs and small skirmishes. And even when it came to civilians, I mean, yeah, you would run into the local populace, but in Afghanistan it was so weird because it didn't even seem like they were necessarily suffering. It almost felt like, you know, the Taliban to a certain extent protects us. The Americans kind of do the same. We're like, as long as you guys leave us alone, we're not going to, show all the drama that instead we experienced like crazy in Iraq, where civilians were indiscriminately targeted by both sides, both the American sides, well, the coalition side, and ISIS. Um, and that was very different. That was very different because between Iraq and Syria, I don't think I probably saw hundreds of brutally wounded children and women and people crying desperately, trying to pick up pieces of their family, on the street. I mean, it was a very different type of conflict.
That was going to be my very next question. Is actually
Oh,
how these conflicts compared. Being embedded with, a conflict that involves the Taliban, for example, where you sort of, although maybe a fairly sort of ghostly type
yeah.
of enemy, but how does that compare to ISIS, for example, in Syria or in Iraq? Because those guys didn't seem to hide themselves very, very much.
They did not seem to hide themselves very much, but also what they played a very smart game of just using, civilians as human shields. So, a lot of times they would take over either houses or hospitals and they would use those as military bases, and start attacks from there, whether as snipers or with rocket propelled grenades, and et cetera, et cetera. Also, at the same time, ISIS was able to just take off their black clothes if they even were wearing those clothes, and just hide themselves in the local populace if they felt like they were being defeated or they were going to lose that building. They would just change in civilian clothes and mix into the populace. And then a lot of times they would just strap on bombs to themselves and blow themselves up. As Iraqi soldiers would be like, okay, come here, civilians, through this way. You can leave the city through here. And then boom, a checkpoint would blow up. The war in Iraq, the war in Mosul was insane. I mean, you never felt safe. There wasn't a second there that you felt safe. Also the level of technology was very limited. You had a lot of small drone warfare, but you didn't have the technology that the coalition really had. So it was mostly night operations and making sure that your perimeters in a city, because this was urban warfare, were fully covered. Because not once, not twice, but three times I've experienced, thank God, not super close, but car bombs. You know, all of a sudden you have these armored vehicles that are just blasting through checkpoints and then coming straight to to the base that you've just built the night before at a random person's house, and boom. You never knew what was gonna happen.
Did you ever feel like you're in a situation that you might not get out of it anymore?
Um, oh, I always felt pretty positive. I think I always felt pretty good about my experience um in combat. Have I ever felt like? I mean, I've I've felt in extreme danger and to the point where I almost panicked myself. Where I saw Iraqi soldiers, being shot in front of me, and me trying to help them with other soldiers drag them from one corner to another because an ISIS sniper has shot them. as we were retreating, because that road ended up being a dead end because that building got blown up and the street was cut off. Um, but I always felt confident. I always felt very, very confident that I would make it out. Yeah.
I mean, how do you get in and out of those scenarios? That's, from just purely from a logistical point of view, how does that work?
Well, once you're inside Mosul, you're inside of Mosul and you're pretty much attached to a unit. Your first step would be to either hike a ride, catch a ride with a resupply vehicle. Then you would either be dropped off at a casualty collection point. That was probably the easiest way of going about it. And then at the casualty collection point, you would probably hitch a ride from an ambulance or other military vehicles that are acting as either resupply for ammo or food, or simply trucks that would bring soldiers back to behind, let's say, enemy lines. And then a lot of times you could even catch a cab, go back to the closest city. I mean, the closest city, and this was super safe city, like a city where you can go and have cocktails and party if you wanted, was only a couple of hours away from there, like 2.5 hours, 3 hours, Erbil. So yeah, wild. That conflict was wild.
Did you ever find yourself in sort of like an ethical dilemma as to whether to photograph something or not? Does that happen in those sort of extreme circumstances?
No, I always feel like you should photograph, and then worst case scenario, you ask for forgiveness. I, I think that everything um, is fair game. I honestly thought that you know photographing soldiers, dead American soldiers, should have been fair game. Um, but at the same time, I guess it's a fine line between what you want and the respect that you want to be give that you want given to the families of those who have lost ones. Are there problems? No, no, I don't, I don't, I don't think
Because I
so.
was thinking very often, especially again in these sort of super extreme situations where people, get shot and potentially die or get, very seriously wounded. Um, I've always felt that it is super important to tell those stories, especially visually, like especially as a photographer, anyway. But I think that reading about a situation like that in a newspaper in words, it really only goes so far. It's really only when the visual element, um, comes in, it's that they really understand what's going on. I mean, 9/11 is a really good example for that. It's very hard to understand how extreme that situation is when somebody tells me, well, people were, I don't know, jumping out of a
Right.
window. When you actually see that, that has a completely different impact.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in Iraq, things were a little bit more relaxed. You could pretty much take photos of everything, but it also, at the same time, there's a very fine line of you know, it's tricky. You also want to be respectful with the unit that you're with, right? Like if you like this unit and you think they can give you a lot more, you might want to think twice before maybe taking a photo of one of their dead brothers. you know
Right.
you it might work both ways. It might be like, yeah, take a photo of him, show it to the world. But if they don't tell you that and you don't get that invitation,
Yeah.
you might not want to risk it, because the commander might be like, you cannot take photos of my dead soldiers, you're out of here, you know what I mean? And then you
Yeah.
lost great access that you worked on for months, so it's yeah, it's tricky.
When you look at contemporary conflicts, like, for instance, the war in Ukraine at the moment, does that make you feel like you want to go back there or not?
No, I don't. I think it's, and don't get me wrong, every conflict is very important to follow and to cover and to be educated on. I think the war in Ukraine is not worth the challenge, in my opinion. It is too much of an open border type war in the sense that there's too much competition when it comes to coverage. I mean, I
Right.
can write you an infinite list of photographers that have been able to get access to the front lines in the units. Most of them photographers that don't have any experience. That's their first conflict, that are going there to try to make a name for themselves. And, so be it. So did I. Um, you know, um, but I don't think it's worth the coverage, in my opinion, from my standpoint. I think the war in Afghanistan was, and that was mainly because I knew for a fact that my work was going to be published, so my work wasn't going to be done in vain. And the war in
Right.
Iraq, uh, also, and it was a logistical nightmare. I mean, you had to have the support of a news organization, or else you would have never been able to afford all the fixers, all the hotels, all the extras, all the equipment. Um, and I don't think I want to do the same with Ukraine. Whether I get the support or not. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that in and especially in Afghanistan during that war, you knew that if you were running into a photographer, it was a professional photographer that was vetted by an agency, that was vetted by the military, that had access to networks, that his work was being published. Because you're going out there with the hope that your work might be published and you have very little experience, I think you are asking for problems.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it sounds pretty insane to me that anybody would do that anyway. But I mean, I can understand how people would,
Bit
but
more insane if you're not being supported by a network and your work is not going anywhere. I mean, like, what a second. Wait a second. Yes, of course you want to make a name for yourself, but that's probably not the best way of getting out there. You know?
yeah, it sounds like a pretty stupid thing that the Instagram generation might do.
Yeah,
Let's just go to these places and get some cool shots. And you go,
yeah.
what
It's
is
too
the
much of a
point?
shortcut. Yeah, so much of a
Yeah.
shortcut.
Do you find that? Because I remember at the very beginning, you mentioned that especially in connection with Ukraine, um, you said it's an open border war. It's these units are pretty much ragtag. Um, I'm guessing that in a situation like this, where it's not like an organized kind of an organized situation like being embedded with the U.S. Army. I mean, to me that just spells trouble. Um, at least,
It smells trouble, and honestly, also on a technical point that I should mention, the chances of you getting hurt in Ukraine are extremely high
mm,
because of the simple fact that artillery is the most used type of weaponry on the ground, and you
right.
cannot escape artillery. If there's an artillery barrage, and I've been through a couple of them, you're not running away from them. Your best luck is to stay put, cross sign, and hope that nothing hits you. And that is 90% of the combat that happens over there. You know,
Yeah.
like,
Um,
not
is that
worth it.
something? And I'm going to come around to what you're doing now, because I remember at the very beginning of the interview you mentioned that what you're doing now is a lot more commercial stuff, and I've seen some of your films, and they're incredible. I particularly like the Adidas one, or Adidas, or however you want to pronounce it.
Mhm.
That's a really great great little film. Um, have you moved away from conflict or war photography entirely? And what made you decide to sort of return to commercial photography and filmmaking at this point?
Sanity. I was tired of traveling so much. I wanted to be put in the US because I was based out of Beirut for many years and then based in other countries for many years. I found somebody that I liked, with whom I wanted to have a family with. I don't think that necessarily was the reason why I stopped. I think one of the main reasons why I stopped is because I feel conflict photography became very trendy, became very cool, more accessible. Let me put it that way. and the competition was just not worth it. Budgets were getting slashed. Networks, publications were less willing to let you go to crazy places or to support, a story. And I was like, who's making me do this? You know what I mean? Like, if I'm going out there and I'm doing something cool, like, I should be paid extremely well and taken care of extremely well. And I feel like in general, there's been a decline in the world of journalism and photography, especially. And a lot of my colleagues that I spend time with in all these places think the same way and have stopped doing it. They still work in some sort of, photography world. Like one of them is a teacher and teaches photography at a school. Another one just makes books, photography books for other photographers. I mean, things have changed.
Why do you think that is? Like, what's led to that decline of photojournalism? Because you're the second guest who's mentioned that. So I'd be interested to know what you think the reason is for that.
I think it's a mix between networks, publications that can find local journalists, local photographers in those regions so easily, between social media, Instagram, just being able to reach people more directly. They can avoid sending reporters from the US or other parts of the world, which is a huge cost saving for them. And also less of a responsibility, because you're sending, a staffer over there, you better make sure that that guy is covered. You don't want to be writing, a letter on your own newspaper saying, I'm sorry, we lost this guy, we sent him to a war zone, and next thing you know, we got him killed. Sort of insurance risk reason. That's one part. And I think the other part is just the conflicts have changed a little bit. Like Syria, Mosul was probably one of the first and last conflicts that were, excuse my language, fucked up enough that made it so you could access it. It wasn't that crazy. You didn't have to ask permission, or you didn't have to necessarily embed with special units. As long as you were on the right side, the Free Syrian Army side, you could get access to them. But you also had to have balls of steel, and that kind of limited the amount of photographers that were coming. But I feel like that was the first and last conflict that kind of, or let's say last conflict, it kind of changed the world of intense, real hardcore conflict photography. Because after that, Mosul was relatively accessible. Ukraine is extremely accessible. Most of these conflicts are pretty open. I mean, it's very difficult to get access to, to the Palestine-Israel, or unless you follow the Israel side, you can't really follow the Hamas side. I mean, that would be great access. That would be the ultimate access. Just a shift in conflicts too, and typology of conflicts, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, again, I had this conversation with Kevin Painshot a few weeks ago. And for anybody who's listening or watching, that's a great episode also to check out. Kevin eventually won a Pulitzer Prize for covering the deluge in Santa Cruz a few years ago. But he also talked about the sort of demise of photojournalism. Mainly, I think he mentioned, it's very often it's a cost-saving exercise, where publications don't want to have staff photographers, on the payroll anymore, and essentially just put a call out to anybody with an iPhone, or whatever to send pictures in.
A local photographer, yeah.
Which of course then that's a problem from a storytelling perspective, I think, very often, because people have agendas and all the rest of it, and you can't really vet that in any way. So I find that difficult. But let's come back to the thing that you do now, because I also found that extremely fascinating. Like I said, obviously I watched some of your work on your website, and I highly recommend it. By the way, again, if you're listening or watching this, you'll find all the links in the description, whether it's in the description to the YouTube video or in the description of the audio podcast. Make sure you check that out. How did you get into that? So you went from fashion photography into photographing war zones, into commercial filmmaking. How did that transition work?
The commercial filmmaking started halfway through the war in Mosul in Iraq, when I found a crazy story, and I said, this story does not live as a photo story. This is either a feature film documentary, a feature doc, or a docuseries. And actually, you can see this docuseries on Amazon Prime. It's called Hunting ISIS. And I found let's say, ragtag unit of military veterans who had decided to go back to Iraq and fight along the militias against ISIS. Free will, no money. They just wanted the action. They just wanted to fight. They thought, wait a second, we fought all these years in these territories. Now they're back into terrorists' control. Wait a second, we lost so many brothers, so many friends over there. Let's go back. Let's clean up the job. So they funded their own trips, their own travels, went over there, got the trust of these local militias, and ended up embedding with them and fighting along their side, going on actual operations. So as soon as I found out about that story, I was like, wait a second, this is fascinating. I mean, you have these Westerners, these white boys going over there and fighting along these militias, these crazy guys. This is an insane story. So I followed them for a couple of years, and we did a documentary series with the History Channel, and it's out. It's been out for a while, and you guys should check it out. It's fun. It's wild.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I actually think this is the thing, because I saw it and I thought, I'm pretty sure I've actually seen that. I think I'm pretty sure I have actually seen that documentary before. And so how did making that documentary lead you into commercial filmmaking back in the States?
I just started liking making videos a little bit more. I think it was a natural progression. I was like, wait a second, I think I'm not great, but I'm pretty decent at this, and I enjoy the process. And it came relatively easy to me. And I was like, let me try this back home, So I started again working with a couple of, digital agencies that, create content for brands, whether it's, Adidas or fashion brands or, pharmaceutical company. We just started creating content for them, started shooting videos, whether they were on location or on set. And it's been relatively, decent. The documentary, I'm not abandoning the documentary world, but I think now I'm focusing more on the documentary video side of things. In fact, now we're in development for another documentary. Maybe we can talk about this next time. Can't disclose it because it's actually with a pretty big network. And we're excited. It's just these things take so long. They're so complicated.
Yeah. It's always great to have a cliffhanger at the end of an episode.
Right,
we'll be back talking about this other thing.
Right. And that was just a natural transition. And I feel like in general, I feel a lot of people that were in the photography world have transitioned to the video world. I think that is the way that someone should start shooting video, is with a photographic background.
I couldn't agree more.
You learn how to learn lighting a lot, static lighting, which is extremely important. If you can recognize static lighting, then you can make it work in the environment, without having to, bring in a million pieces of equipment. Yeah, I think I was blessed with that, with the photography element.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. It's the thing about video is, to me, video is always like it's an extension of photography. It's basically you can tell a story over time as opposed to in one frame. Both of those things are very valid, and it's absolutely true that it's an incredible art form to be able to tell a story in one frame. But video just gives you that additional dimension, almost like a fourth dimension, where you can actually tell something over time, and you can lead the viewer down one path, only then to swing back and create something maybe that's unexpected, or put some kind of twist on it, or whatever. And that's the thing that's always fascinated me about video.
Yeah,
I
call it
you know
call it the live caption of photography, right? Because in photographs, a lot of times you need a caption, right, to kind of extend the message or fully understand what the picture is trying
yeah,
to convey. You don't need that in video, right? It's just a live caption
exactly.
in front
Yeah,
of you.
and you're accessing more a greater number of senses, because you're also you're adding audio and
Right.
everything from sound effects to dialogue to music to whatever, and it's like you're creating even more of a sensual experience when you're watching something like that. So what are your future projects? What are you working on right now, and where do you see your career progressing to over the next few years?
A couple of shoots upcoming, still commercial stuff that pays for the expenses, stuff that I'm not crazy passionate about, but comes easy. You know what I mean? I don't hate it. Yeah. To answer your question really quickly, I guess it's the documentary series that we're currently um, working on, that has a crime angle, and it's based in the U.S. And it's, although we haven't even started shooting, it's already extremely time consuming.
Yeah. Um,
You know,
now that you have a child, and as you have a family, uh, are you sort of in the back of your mind? Are you thinking about potentially going back to a conflict zone, or is that something that you've drawn the line under?
I don't know. That's a question I ask myself, and a lot of people ask me this quite often. I don't think I would want to do it for, um, I guess for my kids. Um, but maybe I would just lie and say that I was going on a vacation, and actually I would be going to a conflict zone if the story and the conflict interested me. I think
Hmm.
if it was worth it, I think that I've never felt so alive and so accomplished, as in I was as when I was covering conflicts. Um,
It's interesting. A lot of people say that whether it's photographers in a conflict zone, or actually soldiers, for example, or part of the military, is that it makes you feel very alive being in those situations.
it's Everything is so simple. Everything is so straightforward. you know um, Sleeping becomes very easy. You know what I mean? You get 4 hours of sleep, you make the most out of it. You sleep, you're not thinking about, oh, I'm only getting 4 hours of sleep, oh, it's going to be a horrible day. No, you get what you get. Food, everything tastes amazing. Even if it doesn't, guess what? You're in a war zone. Take it as it is. You're alive. Your endorphins, and um, your heart is constantly beating. You're making great friends, and friendships are simplified. It's like, we're friends
Mm.
because we're on the same side, and I know that you'll take care of me if I take care of you. And then it's the small little things. You end up being able to get a piece of chocolate, and wow, that is the best chocolate you've ever had. Or you take a shower, and ooh, the shower's lukewarm. Oh my God, this is heaven. It's the small things. Then you come home, and it's all kind of like taken for granted. And I know this sounds
Mm.
very basic, but it really is. And it's difficult to explain to other people. They just don't get it. It's Yeah, it's the most simple life possible, but with, the risk of getting killed. Having a life stripped out of access or excess. excess, excuse English. Sometimes it's just the best.
I think it's easier to sympathize or empathize with, people who really don't have anything, and
Right.
I'm guessing like, the kind of people you meet in those, in those war zones, for example, who have maybe lost everything, or never had anything to start with, and that's the one thing. That's the one thing I really, I feel very strongly about it. And also it's something I feel like I see in your photography when I look at your photography and your portraiture that you've managed to create under those extreme situations, is that empathy for the subject that you're shooting. So, and that being said, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being the guest on this week's Camera Shake podcast.
Yep.
It's an absolutely enlightening, is that even a word? Conversation. So again, thank you again. Okay, folks, that's it for today. It was awesome having Sebastiano on the show. And as always, before we go, let me just recommend another episode that I think you like. Check out episode 219. Check out episode 219 with Pulitzer Prize winner Kevin Painshot. I'm sure you love it. I mentioned it a few times during this episode. Check it out. I'm sure you'll find that super interesting as well. If you enjoy our content, consider supporting us on buymeacoffee.com/CameraShake to help us continue creating and bring you more exciting episodes. It really does mean the world to us. And for those of you who are listening to the audio version of this podcast, did you know that there's a fully fledged video version over on YouTube with plenty of examples of our guest photography in full Technicolor? All you have to do is go over to YouTube, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you'll be able to watch all past episodes on there. And if you're already on YouTube, well, make sure to drop us a comment, hit the like button, ring the bell, and share with your friends. Your engagement helps us reach a wider audience all over the world. And it's pretty amazing to see where people are when they listen to this podcast. It floors me every time. So thank you for listening and watching. And remember, a new episode drops every Thursday. So make sure you mark that in your calendars. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. See you next Thursday.